Today I want to tell you exactly how I directed my PhD thesis like a film in only 3 steps, using my introductory chapter as an example. The introductory chapter is super important for a person like me who loves to tell stories. I knew that it was essential for my PhD thesis to tell a consistent story. It had to build a narrative where the reader was clear what to take home from it. For that narrative building, each part of the thesis has a different function. For me, the body chapters were relatively straightforward. Each chapter had its own internal narrative because I organized the materials to reflect the authentic progression of my research. The investigation naturally unfolded through the data, the analysis, and the arguments. But the broader storyline of the thesis was mainly carried by the introduction and conclusion. The introduction and the conclusion were crucial for building the consistent narrative of the entire thesis. For this 80,000 words magnum opus, the introduction served as a hook, the invitation, and the thread for the reader to enter my thesis world. The conclusion, on the other hand, was the grand reveal. It is where I lay out the entire system of knowledge I built in the form that makes the most sense to both myself and the readers. I always imagine myself writing a textbook where I adopt different forms of presentation, including words, images, bullet points, and the learners can follow whichever path works best for their cognitive style. To give you an example of how I developed my writing in an alluring and cognitively offloading manner, I will walk you through the 3 major steps of how I wrote Chapter 1, the introductory chapter of my 80,000 word PhD thesis. Step 1, the vibes. Function, how I articulate my feelings and visions of my research subject. First, I determined the volume of this chapter. For an 80,000 word thesis, the introductory chapter should sit at the sweet spot of 8,000 to 9,000 words. It should be succinct, not exhausting the readers already before they even enter my theoretical world. At the same time, it should be deeply attractive, almost alluring. For my research, the audience is from both classical philology and theoretical linguistics, and potentially beyond. These people are not usually familiar with each other's lingos and ways of research. I had to make sure readers from both backgrounds understood what I was saying. So, that is one of my signature academic writing styles. I don't flex jargons unless it's absolutely necessary and unless it clarifies things. I simplify rather than complicate. I'm all about reaching a wider audience. I try my best in the way I talk about things, so that whoever is curious can access this subject through my language. This is the same in my PhD thesis writing, in how I describe my research to friends, family, or a stranger who is interested, and in these videos I make for you. On the organization of sections, I was consciously deviating from my old standards. When I was a BA student, an MA student even, I wanted to make sure that my writing satisfied academic regulations, formats, and had the shape of a professional-looking piece of writing. But then, I found myself reluctant to do the same for my PhD thesis. I knew that what I had discovered with my data was so fascinating. I wanted the chapter to satisfy academic requirements, of course. But I wanted more. I wanted it to radiate my research aesthetics. It needed to show how I approached this project, how I use language, how I build structure with beauty, and how I let my argument flow. I wanted the chapter to vibrate my academic persona so clearly that through this piece of academic writing, the reader could almost sense the person behind it. Yes, I love an authorial voice in academic writing. That was my expectation for my own academic work. When I was writing up the introductory chapter, it was approaching the very end of the complete draft. I intentionally left the first chapter to the very end, so that I was fully aware of what kind of story I could tell from all the data, all the theorizing, and all my feelings around them. So, looking at everything I have developed in the past 5 years, years, I knew I had to tell a fascinating story, as it should be, to reflect the amazing sensations and all those epiphanies I experienced while developing this project. I wanted the readers to experience what I had experienced. I wanted them to be deeply hooked, to go through the initial questionings, to discover the glaring problems hiding in plain sight, and then to be led to the tool that could help them see further beyond the surface. I wanted the whole experience for them too. I knew what I needed to do to recreate this experience for them in this entrance chapter of my thesis. Somehow, naturally, I started to have images in my head and feelings attached to those images. Before I realized it, I was experiencing a series of cinematic scenes of how I wanted to tell the story. I wanted to curate the experience for my audience. My research was a fusion of ancient Greek language and modern theoretical linguistics. For me, it feels like fusing advanced technology with an ancient artifact, and realizing that the technology was there to begin with. It's giving ancient alien spacecraft vibes. That's what Greek feels to me. So I wanted to take my audience on an expedition in an ancient-soaked desert, put them in the immersive atmosphere of a millennial mystery. And just as they were fascinated by the surface of the myth, I handed them an X-ray lens and said, "Look, there is a metal part exposed from the sand. There must be something underneath. Go look through the lens yourself, and you'll understand everything." That was the scenario. That was exactly how I felt and how I visualized my project. Now I needed to write an 8,000-word academic chapter that gave the reader the same feeling as the captivating mystery I just described. How did I do that? Simple. I wrote the outline as a film script. I laid out each scene and what it did. That was my step one. Here begins the film script. Enter. I want to have an opening section where I tell stories, leading the audience into the vibe and letting them sense a mystery from thousands of years ago. Then they suddenly realize that they're experiencing this millennia-old mystery in a futuristic room where they can't quite tell when and where they are. They gradually feel the futuristic and cutting-edge technology inside this ancient mystery. They start to feel awe. They feel shocked, but they're deeply captivated by the charisma and the magical persuasiveness of the scene. As if I'm directing a film, I call this vibe writing. It is so primitive and so futuristic, cosmic, deeply human, but it feels like alien technology. This is exactly my aesthetics. I am deeply satisfied. So, that was the opening. Now, how do I officially board my audience onto my ship? Scene 1. After this opening section, we proceed to the first theme. This should be a familiar theme, a comfort zone. All readers can understand it. So this must be a philology zone, because both philologists and theoretical linguists and other humans are already fascinated by ancient mysteries. I don't need to convince them to stay. This is where I give the background of the story, stepping on the shoulders of giants from traditional philology, but I also reveal the problems. Okay, now we have sent out the invitation through a mystery. Then, how do I uncover the technology underneath? The theoretical linguistics part. Scene 2. After this first philology theme, there goes the theoretical linguistics scene. They see some exposed metal parts buried in the sand, and they realize there is something more to it. And as I excavate these metals, the audience gradually realize there's so much more than they expected. Even if they have already watched the trailer which is my abstract. People familiar with this tag, this refers to theoretical linguists, will be excited to see something familiar in such an unexpected place and start to connect and identify with it. People who don't have prior experience of the tag, these are the philologists, will gradually accept it and admire it. Those who are not interested are not my audience. This is where I start to reveal. Yes, indeed. You see the history, but do you also see the skeleton underneath? The tag that was always there. Now, I will hand you the lens, the X-ray that sees beyond the surface layer. Okay, now this is when things get interesting. Scene 3. With this tool, philologists will immediately understand everything because the symbiosis is so natural and everything makes sense when I just touch their forehead with a tap of finger. Sudden enlightenment, a thunderstruck awakening, an upgrade of the mind. Once they see this, they can never go back. This is where I state my problem and build my own theoretical system. I reintroduce the whole thing to them, and everything makes sense in the new architecture I just forged together. Now I've told my story. The action is on them now. They have a choice to make. Scene 4. Finally, I introduce what my project looks like. I hand them a roadmap. I give them the choice to behold the magnificent masterpiece I alchemized in the past decade and beyond. Exit. Step 2. The engineering. This is where I translate my cinematic vision into the formal, rigorous academic structure of chapter 1. Step 1 was about sensing the atmosphere and putting it in words. Step 2 was about engineering the atmosphere into an actual academic architecture. The question became, how do I turn these scenes, sensations, and images into sections, arguments, literature review, theoretical framing, corpus, methodology, and thesis structure? So, I built a map. Not every cinematic scene had to become a separate section. Some scenes became section openings. Some were better suited for transitions. Some became the emotional logic underneath an argument. But every section had to do a clear academic job. Chapter 1. The architecture of the compound. Enter becomes 1.1. The millennial mystery. The cinematic function. This is the entrance scene. I wanted to create fascination, not with a dramatic claim, but with the scale of the object itself. The academic function. This section introduces the double nominal compound as a serious object of inquiry. I did not want to open with borrowed classification or dry data. I wanted to open with my understanding of the subject. Ancient Greek compounds are not marginal ornaments of the language. They are deeply embedded mechanisms of lexical formation. So, this section tells the reader, this is not a tiny technical detail. This is one of the ways ancient Greek organizers thought into lexical form. The hook. To truly understand this object, we cannot just look at the surface. We need to look at the engine within. Scene 1 becomes 1.2, the morphosyntactic surface, the philological tradition, the cinematic function. This is the familiar excavation site, the comfort zone, the warm sunlight, the known surface, the lone tradition, the academic function. This section is the literature review. I welcome the traditional philologists into the room. I review the giants of Greek compound studies, Wackernagel, Chantrain, Risch, Meissner, Tribulato, and others. This is also where I establish my own SEDC model, stem-based etymology of double nominal compounds. For me, this model concentrates 134 years of philological tradition. It shows how beautifully the traditional approach maps the surface of the compound, the structural move. But then, the same section starts to reveal the limit. The comfort zone begins to wobble. The endless debates over headedness, centricity, and syntactic interpretation show that something underneath is unsettled. So academically, this section does two things at once. It honors the philological tradition, and it shows why that tradition needs to collaborate with something else to answer the inquiry. Scene 2 becomes the transition from surface to structure. The cinematic function. This is the exposed metal under the sand. The reader is still in the excavation site, but suddenly something unexpected appeared. The academic function. This is not necessarily a separate section title. It works as the turning point inside the chapter. The academic function here is to shift the reader from the description of the compound to its architecture. I show that the traditional model defines the compound from the outside in. It describes the surface very well. But surface description does not fully explain the internal generative structure of the compound, the reveal. This is where I tell the reader, you're looking at the history. Yes, it is a fascinating one. But is that all? Are we missing something here? Could there be a structure hidden underneath this whole time? We need a scan. An X-ray. Scene 3 becomes 1.3, the distributed morphology model of compounding. The cinematic function. This is the X-ray scene. The lights hum to life. The lens turn on. They see it. The intricate, well-formed, seamless structure underneath this century-old artifact. Sudden enlightenment, thunderstruck clarity, an upgrade of consciousness. The academic function. This section introduces distributed morphology as the second analytical lens. Here, I move from the philological surface into the generative realm. I show that word formation does not have to operate on fully formed nominal or verbal elements. It can operate on acategorial roots before category is assigned later in the derivation. The paradigm shift. The DM model does not destroy the SEDC model. It sits beneath it. The philological model shows the surface, the historical reality of how the words worked. The DM model shows the internal architecture, the generative DNA of a compound. The alien technology is the ancient magic. Everything that looked messy on the surface suddenly becomes part of a multi-layered structure. It was exactly like when people saw human anatomy for the first time. They suddenly understood why the human body functioned the way it did. They understood that it was the bones that supported the body and the arteries and muscles that powered its activity. They did not invent those bones, muscles, arteries. These elements were there to begin with. We just discovered them under the skin. Likewise, once the readers see this for the compound, they can never go back to seeing it the old way. Scene 4 becomes 1.4. Corpus and methodology. The cinematic function. This section is less dramatic on the surface, but it is essential to the engineering of the whole chapter. This is where I show the reader the actual equipment of the project. The academic function, the corpus, the criteria, the data, the method. If 1.3 gives the X-ray lens, then 1.4 shows how I use it responsibly. The structural move. This section makes the whole project academically operational. It tells the reader, this is not just a beautiful theoretical vision or some new jargon to flex. This is a research design that can actually run. Exit becomes 1.5. The roadmap of the thesis. The cinematic function. The doors open to the multi-dimensional grand gallery. The reader has been invited in, shown the mystery, guided through the tradition, given the X-ray lens, and shown the method. Now they are ready to enter the full thesis world. The academic function. This section gives orientation. I show them where to walk next. Chapter 2, the Homeric baseline. Chapter 3, the classical expansion. Chapter 4, the cognitive processing case studies. Chapter 5, the conclusion. The invitation. At this point, I invite them to step fully into the world I have alchemized over the past decade. Why this structure feels academically lethal to me, I realized that I was naturally using the psychological principles of pacing and leading. I pace my readers by beginning with classical philology, a subject infused with ancient mystery and lures all humans. I validate the tradition before I challenge its limits. Then I lead them to the edge of that model, and once they feel the limits, I catch them with a mathematically precise safety net. I introduce the theoretical structure underneath it. This isn't just a flat lit review anymore. It is a carefully orchestrated initiation ritual into my theoretical world. It is designed to synchronize both classical philologists and theoretical linguists to the symbiotic frequency of my thesis. How did it feel to see my cinematic vision mapped directly onto the formal requirements of a PhD thesis? It felt freaking amazing! My entire soul was uplifted. Step 3. The full formal writing of my academic chapter. In step 3, the cinematic outline finally became the formal academic chapter. This is where things became really cool, almost on a galactic scale, because I could see the original feeling, the original atmosphere, and the original visual structure mapped directly onto rigorous academic prose. Now, I invite you all to listen, feel, and experience how the formal academic writing still carries the original cinematic atmosphere, from mystery to problem to method to the opening of the thesis world. Double nominal compounding in ancient Greek. Chapter 1. Introduction. 1.1. The millennial mystery. Ancient Greek is characterized by its profound capacity for nominal compounding, a feature that has captivated scholars since antiquity. Compounds are not marginal ornaments of the language, nor are they confined to a narrow poetic register. They're a deeply embedded mechanism of lexical formation, visible from the earliest attestations of Greek and continuously active across different periods, genres, and textual environments. In Homeric poetry, they contribute to the density and precision of the diction. In later Greek, they persist in altered distributions, modified stylistic functions, and increasingly differentiated lexical roles. The ancient Greek compound is therefore not merely a historical curiosity of word formation. It is one of the most revealing morphological structures through which the language organizes thought into lexical form. This is the entrance scene. It tells the reader, this is not a tiny technical problem. This is a structure through which ancient Greek organizes thought into lexical form. Then I sharpen the question. At the broadest level, the thesis is organized around one question only. What is a compound? More specifically, what is a double nominal compound in ancient Greek? I am not asking this in a narrow classificatory sense alone. The question is not exhausted by asking whether a given form should be labeled endocentric or exocentric, whether one constituent should be treated as the head, or whether a particular item is synchronically transparent or opaque. Those questions matter, and they will be addressed where necessary, but none of them reaches the most basic architectural issue. Before the compound can be classified, interpreted, or processed, it must first exist as a generative object. This is where the thesis moves from surface classification to architecture, not just how do we label compounds? What kind of object is a compound before we even classify it? After that, the chapter moves through the scenes I designed. 1.2. The morphosyntactic surface, the philological tradition. Section 1.2 is the philological tradition, the warm excavation site, The familiar surface, the 134-year tradition. 1.2.1 The 134-year tradition. This is where I honor the philological tradition and stand on the shoulders of the giants. 1.2.2 The SEDC model. This is where I concentrate this 134-year tradition into my own methodological model. 1.2.3 The mini-sentence illusion and the classificatory trap. This is where I land my critique of the tradition and depart for my own academic pursuit. 1.3 The distributed morphology model of compounding. Section 1.3 is the X-ray lens, the distributed morphology model where I move into the generative architecture underneath the surface. 1.3.1 Probing into the generative realm. This is where you look through the X-ray lens and discover the skeleton underneath. 1.3.2 Mapping generation, lexicalization, and interpretation. A DEM hypothesis. This is where I demonstrate my own formula that encapsulates my understanding of nominal compounds. 1.3.3 Separating generation from lexicalization. This is a critical theoretical claim that the thesis makes. 1.4 Corpus and methodology. I introduce what I study and how I study it. 1.5 The roadmap of the thesis. I hand you the map to my intellectual world, and you choose whether to take it, enter, or not. The chapter closes this opening movement with these words. The millennial mystery, then, is that ancient Greek compounds remain structurally unsettled where they appear most familiar. Double nominal compound is the point at which this instability becomes most visible. It is the point at which description reaches its limit and a generative architectural question must begin. This thesis begins from that point. That is the moment when the entrance scene closes. The mystery has been established, the surface has been disturbed, the X-ray has been introduced, and now the thesis can begin. So that was the complete process of my vibe writing. First, I sensed the atmosphere of the project. Then I turned that atmosphere into a cinematic/academic outline. Finally, I translated the whole vision into a rigorous academic chapter. This method of thesis writing suits me so well. It aligns with my personality, my aesthetics, and my way of thinking. The final creative result pleases me at a soul level. The chapter is academic, formal, and rigorous, but to me, it still carries the exact feeling I had at the very beginning. Ancient, futuristic, mysterious, deeply human, and almost cosmic. And I am very satisfied with that. My first audience were my supervisors. Judging from their feedback, I think it worked. One supervisor followed the thesis draft closely and gave me positive feedback. The other supervisor, after receiving my submitted thesis, sent me congratulations from an academic conference in Mexico City. He praised the work and encouraged me for the viva. I am also lucky to have two examiners beautifully representing the two worlds of my project. An expert in classical philology from the University of Cambridge, and an experienced generative linguist from the CNRS of France. I feel deeply grateful that this thesis will be read and discussed from both sides of the intellectual world I try to bring together. At the end of this month, we will meet in London for what I believe will be a rewarding viva voce examination. Now, before the viva, I am here, cheerfully telling you how I wrote this thesis, how I built its narrative, and how I used a cinematic, aesthetic, multidimensional method to create a piece of academic work. That was my process of vibe writing. I did not just write a thesis. I directed it straight from the visions in my head and the feelings in my body.